Development MA here. And before that, I did geography at the University of Cambridge and spent 3 years in the in-between in the UK civil service. So spent a lot of time in some pretty historically colonial institutions. And I only sent like 3 bullet points through because mostly I wanted to come to this conference to learn more because I felt like I didn't know that much about decolonizing. But the main bugbear I had about decolonizing was there seemed to be this lack of historical understanding of empire, colonization, and development in the colonizer countries. Like the colonial countries, they learn about empire because that's the history they're given. They're not necessarily given their own histories. They're given the histories that are either imposed on them by the colonizers themselves, or whether that's through the textbooks that they're getting. Like in our group, someone gave the example of they've been working in Chad and the textbooks are French and they're the same as the French curriculum, even though that's not necessarily relevant to people who are living in Chad. And initially I set this forward as like an issue within development studies itself, but obviously this lack of historical understanding is in like education itself as a worldwide issue. And my personal experience was that I studied history up until the age of 16, and I honestly don't recall a moment where the word empire was used. And that's living in the UK, the word empire wasn't used. We encountered slavery and how it was abolished, but not really saw how that was like a major part of what made Britain and how that was institutionalized. And I felt that this was, a massive lack. But in the last group we were talking, Claudine pointed out that it's not necessarily that we're not being taught about it, that it's a lack of context, that the context disappears. We learn about British history, we learn about industrialization, all of these things are learned about, but without the context of imperialism behind it. And I think this is really important to definitely British identity today, and probably a lot of other European identities, is there's that lack of context behind things, the kind of things that can fuel something like Brexit comes from the idea of like making Britain great again. And that made me really uncomfortable when people were saying it, because I was like, but you know why Britain was great, because we took over other countries, we enslaved people, we stole things. And you get blank faces back, because that isn't what people are taught. They're taught that their country was great, it's in the name, and then there's no interrogation where that greatness came from. And and that becomes problematic. And this was something that was discussed in the first group. The point I came away with, the question I wanted to ask was, how can we decolonize development studies and decolonize the academy when larger structures remain colonizing or have not confronted their coloniality? Like Ziandri said at the beginning, like how do we decolonize in the home of colonization? And the issue that I thought was like really sums this up in how Britain can deal with this was recently there has been a campaign at the University of Cambridge by the Kusu Women's Campaign, which is led by Lola Olufeme, and she wrote an open letter after there was a discussion with some students about trying to get more writers that weren't white, that weren't male, on the English literature reading list. So again, like the importance of like the literature that people are being represented in. They were not by any means saying like they wanted like all black reading lists or all women reading lists, which even if they did, I don't think that would necessarily be unreasonable. But this tiny open letter that was signed by 100 students, the mainstream British media got hold of this and tore her apart. Not even just the students, tore her apart. As a black student at Cambridge, which is a very rare thing indeed, you had people like the Times and the Telegraph tearing her apart for suggesting there should be no white writers, which was not what was being said at all. And like the amount of public fury that came up with this shows that Britain has not decolonized itself. And it hasn't interrogated why white thought and why white male thought and why white male colonial thought is still given primacy. And I find that frustrating as institutions that I've been part of. And also the continuing institutions, how can we break that down? So that came to the second point that I put forward in my email, which was how can we use decolonized development studies to help further academic decolonization, which has kind of been expressed through today, that it isn't just decolonizing development studies won't solve the problems, that it's other subjects, whether it's literature, whether it's history, not just in a university context, but the fact that 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds are being taught things about their nations and their people from people hundreds of thousands of miles away who've never come into contact with them. And the last point that I had was how can development studies empower students to continue decolonization when they leave academia. And someone in an earlier group said something I liked, which linked to that word empower and power in a very like scientific sense. It's that capturing the save the world energy, which I think we talked about, that we don't want to lose that energy in all the deconstructing and stuff like that. And I don't have the answer of how we can do it, but it is definitely capturing that energy. Obviously, like the people who come here today have that energy, and like how we can use that in the future. Yeah.